Call to order this hearing of the Legislative Audit Commission on January 29th, 2026, 1:05 p.m. If the clerk would take the roll.
Senator Rest.
Present.
Representative Anderson. Representative Anderson. Senator Barr. Senator Barr is online. Senator Dibble. Senator Dibble. Senator Drazkowski.
Present.
Representative Greenman. Representative Greenman. Representative Hansen.
Here.
Representative Jacob.
Jacob here.
Senator Karan.
Here.
Representative Lee.
Lee present.
Representative Quam.
Present.
Senator Zhang. Senator Zhang. That completes the roll, and we do have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Quorum is then present. We're here to have a presentation on the Office of Ombudsperson for Families, and we welcome Deputy Auditor Jody Munson Rodriguez and the Caitlin Badger, the Evaluation Manager. We'll hear a response later from Ann Hill. You know, that person's name is extremely close to mine. If you put an ER on it, I was Ann Hiller for many years of my life. So I'm curious to see if she's a doppelganger or something. Anyway, welcome to the commission, and Deputy Auditor, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. For the record, my name is Jody Munson Rodriguez, and I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. We appreciate you taking time to hear our key findings and recommendations for the evaluation of the Ombudsperson for Families. As most of you are probably aware, Minnesota unfortunately has a long history of disproportionately involving children of color in the child protection system. The 1991 legislature created the Office of Ombudspersons for Families to be a resource for families and professionals involved in the system to help ensure culturally appropriate supports and services were available. During our evaluation, we spoke with a wide variety of stakeholders, including culturally specific nonprofit organizations and other government agencies, and learned that the role of the Ombuds Office is still very much necessary 30 years later. However, as Ms. Badger will detail in her presentation, we found that the office has not always fulfilled that role effectively in recent years. With the permission of Madam Chair, I'll now hand it over to Caitlin Badger, the Evaluation Manager.
Thank you, Deputy Auditor. Ms. Badger.
Chair Rest, members, I want to thank you for having us here today. For the record, my name is Caitlin Badger. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I was the manager of this evaluation. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank my colleagues on this project, Stephanie Best and Roman Morris, both of whom have joined us here today as well. And I'd also like to thank staff from the Office of Ombudsperson for Families for their assistance throughout our evaluation. Taking a step back before I dive into our key findings, I think it's important, as Deputy Legislative Auditor said, to highlight that individuals we spoke with really expressed strongly the need for an office such as the Office of Ombudsperson for Families, or OBFF. However, as was mentioned in evaluating the office, we found some significant issues and areas for improvement. First off, we found that the Ombudsperson's duties in law are broad, while the office has relatively limited resources given the nature of its duties. Second, we found that the Ombudspersons do not fulfill all of their required duties in law, while at the same time spending considerable time on activities that are not required by law. Ultimately, we found that the office's impact in recent years is unclear. With regard to OBFF's complaint handling activities, we found significant issues across that area of their work as well. And finally, we found that there has not been adequate oversight or accountability for the office. So with that overview, let's start with what is an ombudsperson? In the public sector, ombudspersons work to guarantee that laws are administered in ways that are fair and consistent. Their general aim is to ensure that government and government-regulated agencies respect citizens' rights. Typically, ombudspersons receive and address complaints about the actions taken by a specific entity, such as a government agency, and then recommend changes to government policies or practices as needed. The state of Minnesota has numerous ombudsperson offices, many of which support individuals in specific circumstances, and OBFF is one such office. So then what is OBFF? OBFF is meant to ensure that children and families of color that are involved in the child protection system are treated fairly and appropriately. As was mentioned, Minnesota unfortunately has a long history of racial and ethnic disparities in the child protection system. As an example of that, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families recently reported that children who are African American or who are Hispanic are both around 2 times more likely than white children to be in out-of-home care, also called foster care. Children who are 2 or more races are around 8 times more likely than white children to be in out-of-home care. The legislature established OBFF to help ensure that these entities working with children and families of color in the child protection system follow the law and act in a manner that's sensitive to cultural needs and differences. State law establishes 3 ombudspersons in OBFF, each serving children and families of belonging to specific communities of color. These ombudspersons are the Ombudsperson for African American families, who serves African and African American families, the Ombudsperson for Asian Pacific families, who serves members of the Asian Pacific communities, and finally the Ombudsperson for Spanish-speaking families, who serve members of the Hispanic and Latino communities. Each ombudsperson is appointed by a community board, and that board has responsibility for overseeing those their respective ombudspersons, and I'll talk more in detail about these boards a little bit later. I'll note there's also in Minnesota an Office of Ombudsperson for American Indian Families. Well, that individual used to be part of OBFF a few years ago. They became their own separate office, and so I just bring that up. They were not a part of the scope of this evaluation. So although traditionally ombudspersons focus on addressing complaints and concerns about the actions or decisions of government entities, the legislature assigned OBFF with much broader duties. For example, as you can see here on the screen, OBFF is required by law to monitor agency compliance with all child protection laws as they impact children of color. They're also required to work with state courts on various activities, including ensuring that experts from appropriate communities of color are used as court advocates and several other duties. Statutes also outline a few things that OBFF has authority to do but is not required to do, such as conducting investigations of certain aspects of the child protection system. Before I talk about how well OBFF is fulfilling these duties, I would like to take a step back to discuss the real breadth of OBFF's duties in law. OBFF's duties in law are broad, as you can see on page 7 of our report, and I'll highlight here just an example of one of those duties to give you a sense of that breadth. So I'll focus on their requirement in law that they monitor agency compliance with child protection laws. There are currently thousands of children of color in out-of-home placement, and even more are currently involved in the child protection system overall. Statutes require OBFF to, quote, monitor agency compliance with all laws governing child protection and placement as they impact children of color. And this might seem straightforward, perhaps. However, statutes define agency very broadly, which means that OBFF, to fulfill this duty, has to monitor whether a wide swath of entities are complying with law. Agency by law, for instance, includes any individual or service or program providing child protection or placement services in coordination with or contract under DHS or MDH. It also includes all local courts. It includes county social services agencies that provide child protection and placement services. So in addition to having to monitor a really wide variety of entities, some folks may be familiar, several of those entities take different approaches to their work within the child protection system. So, for instance, Minnesota's 87 counties can and do often take different approaches to their work. Likewise, Minnesota's 10 judicial districts and the courts within them also take different approaches to their child protection work. So if OBFF is to truly monitor, quote, agency compliance with law, it can't just monitor, say, one county or one judicial district. It has to really monitor all of them because they're taking different approaches. Despite these broad duties, OBFF is a relatively small office. As you can see here, in addition to the 3 ombudspersons, OBFF has 4 other staff with various responsibilities. In fiscal year 2025, OBFF's total appropriation was $845,000, although I'll note, as you can see here on this slide, they haven't consistently been spending their full appropriations in recent years. So still with a staff of 7 people and a budget of under $1 million, effectively monitoring all of these agencies' compliance with law, in addition to its other required duties, does pose significant challenges for the office. So with that, now I'll pivot to just sort of talk about how effectively OBFF has been fulfilling these duties. Over the course of our evaluation, we determined that the ombudspersons are not fulfilling all of their duties as required by law. For instance, the 3 ombudspersons described taking limited actions to fulfill some of their court-related duties and not fulfilling some of those court-related duties, other court-related duties at all. The ombudspersons also described taking a limited approach to monitoring agency compliance with child protection laws. Well, it's maybe not a surprise that they aren't fulfilling all of their required duties in law, given the breadth of those duties and the office's resources. We also found that further exacerbating this is that the ombudspersons spend considerable time on activities that aren't required by law. For example, the office reported that developing public policy is a key component of their work. And as you can see on page 27 of our report, they're members of a wide variety of work groups and task forces. The ombudspersons told us that these activities are important, but I'll note that none of them are actually required by law. Further, some of the work groups, for instance, in which the ombudspersons have been participating, such as the City of St. Paul's Human Rights and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, are not clearly relevant to their statutory responsibilities. So in taking a look at how well OBFF has fulfilled these duties, we did take a broader look to consider the office's impact. So for instance, maybe OBFF's approach to its duties has been really impactful, even if it hasn't been in alignment with law. Unfortunately, however, we found that OBFF's impact in recent years, whether it's on families or children of color specifically, or on the child protection system more broadly, is unclear. When we reached out to the ombudspersons, most of the child protection-related accomplishments they reported revolved around advocating for policy changes and participating in work groups. While we don't dispute that there can be value to some of these activities, they don't align with the office's required duties, and OBFF's role in moving these initiatives forward and their sort of overall impact has been unclear. The majority of the accomplishments the ombudspersons reported pertain to more sort of administrative type things they have done in recent years, such as revising the office's letterhead or updating their website. And we do know that these activities take time and effort. However, they just don't really speak to the office's overall accomplishments with regard to its specific purpose. We also reached out to people across the child protection system, including representatives of the executive branch, the judicial branch, staff members of community organizations that have served families of color involved in the child protection system, and others, just to hear their insight into OBFF's work. And while these individuals really strongly expressed the need for an office to be a resource for people of color involved in the child protection system, many were unfamiliar with OBFF specifically. A key judge, for instance, told us they'd never heard of OBFF and that the office isn't on the radar of judges across the state. Similarly, none of the individuals at the community organizations that we spoke with who are working with families of color involved in the child protection system were familiar with OBFF. Even though many people were unfamiliar with the office specifically, we did ask them for their opinion on what they thought the office should be doing. While several individuals that we spoke with agreed that OBFF's duties in law were appropriate, many suggested ways in which OBFF's duties should be refined, either by giving them more responsibilities and/or requiring them to do things that are currently optional in law. For instance, they commented on a need for OBFF to conduct more community outreach, do policy work, conduct investigations, and more. I'll note that, in general, many of the individuals that we spoke with indicated that OBFF has sort of a two-pronged role to play. One, that they should be both assisting individual children and families through their complaints work and addressing those individuals' needs, and seeking to make broader changes to the child protection system. Many of the activities that the interviewees indicated that OBFF should do would be an expansion of OBFF's current duties in law. So pulling all of these threads together, we do recommend that the legislature take another look at OBFF's duties in law and revise them as necessary to ensure that they align with the legislature's goals for the office and are indicative of how the legislature would like the office to spend its time and resources. If the legislature, for instance, envisions OBFF spending a lot of time on policy work or serving in a lot of work groups, then we would recommend that the laws reflect those duties. Also, as part of ironing out the scope of OBFF's duties, we also recommend that the legislature ensure that the office's resources align with those duties, and we talk about some different levers that could be pulled to do that in the report. With regard to OBFF, we recommend that the office fulfill all duties required by law, and if the office feels that its duties in law are not in alignment with how it thinks it can best serve community needs and outcomes for children and families of color, then OBFF should bring proposed changes to the legislature to its statute or regarding its statutory duties. I'm going to shift gears a bit to talk briefly about OBFF's complaint handling work. One of the key questions we were asked to take a look at for this evaluation is how well is OBFF investigating complaints it receives? I have to be honest, it was a little difficult to wrap our hands around this question due to significant deficiencies both in how OBFF documents its complaints work and the data that it collects regarding complaints. So, for instance, because of this lack of data and documentation, we were unable to get clear answers to simple questions such as how many complaints has OBFF received, or how many complaints did it investigate, or even how many complaints were substantiated. This lack of data and documentation also makes it difficult to determine whether the office has been complying with requirements in law, whether it's been complying with best practices, or even what effect OBFF's complaint handling work has had on children and families. So despite these challenges, we do have several findings and recommendations pertaining to OBFF's complaint handling activities. First finding on this front is just that the scope of OBFF's complaint handling is quite limited. In reviewing a sample of recent complaints, we found that the way that OBFF goes about looking into these complaints is pretty limited and usually consists of them primarily just reviewing some court files, if that. OBFF has also limited what they investigate in terms of limiting the types of complaints that they investigate. Ultimately, OBFF conducts relatively few investigations. While they didn't issue an annual report in 2025, in its most recent annual report from 2024, the office reported conducting only 33 investigations over the course of the previous year. Although I will note that 33 investigations, because of the quality and lack of data, we weren't able to actually verify whether that number was correct. For the sake of time, I'm not going to review all of our findings in this area. However, as you're likely getting the sense, we did find some significant issues. I already mentioned that OBFF didn't adequately document its work or maintain adequate data on complaints. We also found, among other issues, that OBFF has few complaint handling policies or procedures, that they handled complaints inconsistently, and that OBFF did not follow complaint handling best practices. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, complaint handling is often sort of the bread and butter, if you will, of an ombudsperson's responsibilities. And even if OBFF isn't currently required by law to address complaints, several individuals we spoke with really described how this complaints work is an important aspect of OBFF's role in the child protection system. Our opinion is if OBFF is going to continue to receive complaints, we really think it needs to significantly improve this complaints handling practices, and we have several recommendations about how to do so in Chapter 2 of our report. So with that, I'm going to transition now to the last group of findings and recommendations that we'll talk about here today, and these pertain to OBFF's oversight and accountability. I'm going to talk first briefly about the main external oversight mechanisms for OBFF, which are its community boards. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of my presentation that OBFF has 3 community boards that are responsible for appointing the ombudspersons and overseeing these respective ombudspersons. And you can see those 3 boards listed here on the slide. OBFF's boards are the primary entities to which OBFF and its ombudspersons are accountable. By law, these boards are responsible for advising and assisting the ombudspersons with various aspects of their work, such as developing policies and plans to carry out the ombudsperson's functions. The individual community boards are also required to meet all together as one joint board, and statutes direct this joint board to oversee the office more generally by advising the ombudspersons on overall policies, plans, et cetera, for the office overall. By law, each community board should have 5 members, and they're appointed to 4-year terms. Overall, we found that OBFF's boards have not provided adequate oversight of the office. First, we found issues with how frequently the boards meet. There are requirements in law for how frequently both the community boards and that joint board must meet, yet for most of the boards, there wasn't evidence of them meeting those requirements. I put the requirements for the joint board here on the slide as an example, and as you can see, by law, the joint board is required to meet at least 4 times per year. When we looked at meeting information from the joint board from 2022 through 2024, we found that the joint board met this requirement for only 1 of those 3 years. Further, when the boards meet, they often had issues with members not attending the board meetings. So again, taking the joint board as an example, from January 2022 through October 2025, we found that OBFF's joint board had an average of only 6 attendees, and that's in comparison to the 15 total attendees that by law comprise that board, so less than half. We also found that all of OBFF's joint boards rarely, if ever, fulfilled their duties in law. Again, taking the joint board as an example, the joint board is required by law to advise the ombudsperson on various things. You can see them listed here on this slide. However, in reviewing board documents, we didn't find any evidence of the board fulfilling these responsibilities in recent years. So we have a number of recommendations for OBFF's boards in our report, including but not limited to that the boards should meet in accordance with requirements in law, they should ensure consistent attendance amongst members, and that the board should fulfill their duties as required by law. I'll shift now to our last finding that I'm going to discuss today, and this finding has to do with accountability as it pertains to OBFF's overall organizational structure. So OBFF's organizational structure presents several issues and challenges, most critically being that it's resulted in an office that lacks clear lines of authority and accountability. OBFF has kind of an odd organizational structure in that there is no designated leader for the office. In practice, each of OBFF's 3 ombudspersons kind of share equal powers and responsibilities. For instance, they share responsibility for managing the office's operations. They share responsibility for human resources, share responsibility for the budget. As part of our evaluation, we did review a selection of other ombudspersons' offices in Minnesota, and we found that this organizational structure within OBFF is unique amongst those offices. All of the other offices we reviewed clearly had a leader, one person in charge with responsibility for guiding and overseeing the office. When 3 ombudspersons share responsibility equally for the office's actions and directions, it's unclear ultimately then who is responsible if the office fails to meet performance expectations or fails to follow the requirements in law. So we do recommend to improve OBFF's accountability and ensure there are clear lines of authority within the office. we recommend that the legislature establish a single position within the office that is responsibility for leading it. And we provide several options in the report for different permutations of what that might look like. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll remind members that we do have quite a few additional recommendations on page 55 of our report. However, I'll wrap up my formal remarks for the day, and I'm happy to stand for questions or step aside for OBFF to make the remarks, whatever Madam Chair would prefer.
Are there questions or comments about the report? Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of questions. On slide 4, you have that 2X figure. What is the total number, or what is the percent that fits into the 3 groups, and then the total number of out-of-home care children?
Representative Quam, what, are you referring to something in this or in the report?
Slide 4 of the
Slide 4,
presentation.
okay. Thank you. Ms. Badger.
Madam Chair and Representative Quam, thanks for the question. I might point you to page 5 of our report. We've got some of that data broken down a little bit more. This is all data from the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So you can see some of the more specific breakdowns in that graphic in Exhibit 1.1. In terms of some totals, I'm looking to see here. We have some information on CHIPS cases. And I'm trying to recall where that is.
Madam Chair,
Representative Quam.
for clarification, because we are broadcast, I wanted the public to have that. If they saw slide 4, I'm sure they're curious as to, it's twice as likely, but when you break it down to total percent of out-of-home care covered by the 3 defined groups, what percentage of the total? I thought that'd be an easy enough question. If you have to give it to us offline, I guess. I thought you would have that.
Ms. Badger.
Senator Rest, and thank you, Representative Quam. It's a great question, so I can read through some of these things. So for instance, you can see with children who are African American or Black, they comprise 12% of the child population in the state, whereas within out-of-home care, they comprise 14% of the population. Similarly, children who are Hispanic or Latino, they comprise 9% of the total child population in the state, whereas it's 10% of children in out-of-home care. For children who are 2 or more races, comprise 6% of the total child population in the state, comprise 26% of children in out-of-home care. So some differences there in terms of what you might expect with the total population of children and how it's not in alignment with the share of children in out-of-home care.
Representative Quam.
Thank you. You could have just stated so that the people watching at home realize that half of the people or half of the children in out-of-home care don't fall into these 3 groups. Because I think it's important, because we're defining and funding help, but that brings the, well, if I can go on to my next question, slide 9, what is the total spent on these non-required activities? Madam
Ms.
Chair,
Badger.
thank you.
Sure. Ms. Badger.
Senator Rest and Representative Quam, we have information about the office's expenditures on page 10 of our report. They're not broken down by the types of functions that the office does. That level of data isn't collected. It's a great question, and so what we can offer is generally, payroll is certainly the largest share of the office's expenses.
Thank you, Representative Quam. Senator Drazkowski.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Badger. Ms. Badger, I was looking at the statutes as you were going through your report, and there's a piece in the statute that talks about the different agencies that appoint the ombudspersons, and it suggests that they have to be people who are who are professionally capable. I can't think of a better way to describe it. I don't have it in front of me now, but did you find that that was met amongst the appointments that were made for these 3 individual positions? Did they appoint people that met that requirement in statute, that they are competent in their field and understanding of the law?
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rest and Senator Drazkowski, thanks for the question. And you're correct, there is some language in law about the ombudspersons being highly competent and qualified to analyze questions of law, administration, public policy. So I believe that's the information that you're referring to. The ombudspersons, and I'm sure they would be happy to speak to their qualifications and how long they have been with the office. And we do have all of the ombudspersons here today. The ombudspersons have been members of the office for many, many years and have various backgrounds. For instance, one is an attorney. The others, I'm sure, could speak to some of their professional qualifications, social services backgrounds, things like that. And they are certainly here today to testify that as well.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. Senator
Madam Chair,
Drazkowski, anything further?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do. So, Ms. Badger, did you find them to meet that qualification in the law?
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rest and Senator Drazkowski. So we took a look generally at the extent to which they were meeting their duties. And as I mentioned, I think we have some concerns about the extent to which that is happening. Spending time, as I mentioned, on more of these not required, not even necessarily explicitly named activities in law. And so we do highlight that as a concern in our report, that they're not fulfilling those duties as one would expect.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair?
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you. One more question, Ms. Badger, and I don't know that I got an answer to that, but I did understand what you said. And I'm looking at the powers that the law gives these folks in these 3 positions, including subpoena power if the complaints aren't reacted to by the court or other individuals under which they're given authority. So this is serious business that we as a legislature have given to these folks. And it seems to me that instead of doing their job the way the law reads, I don't read that there's any deficiencies in the law. I guess I was troubled by the notion that since they aren't doing what they're supposed to do in law, that we should go as a legislature and look at what the law says and maybe change it. That's what I thought I heard. The question I mean, I'm wondering why these people aren't following the law and doing what we gave them as a responsibility to do. The law seems to be fleshed out pretty well. So 2 questions for you. Did you find any particular deficiencies in the law that direct them as an agency at doing what they're supposed to do? Are there any particular deficiencies? And maybe I didn't read that far enough in the report. But then also, you mentioned that they were acting as advocates for certain policy changes, kind of an activist type of role, which we did not give them to do. I'm curious, what activist roles did you see them involved in, and what particular work groups did you see them involved in that we did not give them the responsibility in law to be involved with? What were those activities that you saw them doing that they were doing that we didn't tell them to do? I guess that's the second part of my question.
Ms. Munson Rodriguez, was that a question you would like to respond to?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could respond to your first question, Senator Drazkowski, I appreciate it. If I could just point you back to slide 7 from our presentation. I'd like to read it. It says, monitor agency compliance with all child protection laws. That is one of the required duties in law currently for this organization that is headed by 3 individuals. And so just by, as Ms. Badger broke down, honestly, the impossibility of an agency of this size being able to monitor all agency actions within this realm. This is a place where we suggest that the legislature could take another look at statutes and hone in on the places where they believe that this organization could do the most, be the most effective. That type of broad mandate is very difficult to meet with the level of resources that they currently have. And I will move over to Ms. Badger for the second piece, if that's all right with Madam Chair.
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rest and Senator Driscoski, to answer your second question, particularly about, for instance, the work groups that the ombudspersons are members of, I'll point members to page 27 of the report. We did compile a list of the various work groups that they're involved in. As I mentioned, and I think some of these work groups that they're participating in, while maybe one can draw a thin line of connection to some of the work that they're doing, there are some that seem somewhat less directly relevant. I mentioned already the City of St. Paul's Human Rights and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There are a couple of others listed on this page here on page 27 in terms of giving the full scope of the entities that they've been, work groups that they've been participating in. I'll note by law, they're not required to participate in any of these work groups. There is one committee, I guess I will call it, that they are permitted to participate as a member of. So on page 7, as one of the permitted duties, the Ombudsperson for African American families may be a member of DCYF's African American Child and Wellbeing Advisory Council. But aside from that permitted council that they may be a member of, this sort of work group task force participation is not required by law.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, I didn't get the first part of the second question answered, and that was, Ms. Badger, if you could, what are the areas of activism or policy advocacy that you saw the office involved with that wasn't prescribed by law?
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rest and Senator Driscoski, they described being members of various work groups or doing sort of community education sessions, things like that, around some of the more recent legislation that has been taking place in the child protection realm. So for example, a pretty significant change to child protection law in Minnesota recently was the Minnesota African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the ombudspersons reported being involved in processes around that, for example, submitting testimony to committees, state legislative committees on that. They also highlighted some work that they've been doing with regard to some federal legislation, the Family First Services Act. Again, another sort of more major change in the child protection realm that's more on the federal side. And so, whether again, participating in various committees and organizations trying to get some of these changes, policy changes off the ground that have been sort of driven by these more legislative changes, or educating folks, a couple different areas they've been working on with regard to sort of legislative changes.
So Madam Chair, just to comment quickly, thank you,
Senator
Ms. Badger,
Driscoski.
but thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Badger. So Madam Chair, members, once again, I just hearken back to the state lottery and their really refusal to do what we asked and told them to do in law, and they were paving their own way to do things that we didn't ask them to do, or do things differently the way they wanted to do them. Here, again, we have another agency or office involved in policy advocacy, both at the state and federal levels. Even though it's in the content area that they are to be working in, there is nowhere in law that I have read that they're asked to go out and develop legislation or develop advocacy or activism for legislation. The wheels are coming off here, and it's not very good to see. So thank you, Ms. Badger. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair Rest. Very interesting report. The more I try to understand it, I think the more questions I have. I'm trying to really understand, I think, the authority of the OBFF, and not just the authority of the OBFF, but the board that they answer to. So can you help me understand this board and the members that are not attending these meetings? And does OBFF answer to that board, or does that board answer to OBFF? I need some clarity on that.
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rest and Representative Jacob, thanks for the question. I will point folks just as a little bit of an overview to page 8 of our report, and you can sort of see how this is structured with various council members or councils appoint these boards. So for example, the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs appoints the members of the Spanish-speaking board. The Spanish-speaking board amongst the other community boards in terms of sort of their role, their authority. I mentioned they, by law, have the responsibility for appointing the ombudspersons. They also have responsibility or are the only entity with authority in law to remove the ombudspersons for cause if there are concerns. And they do have certainly responsibility by law for providing, in the language in law is to advise, quote, advise and assist the ombudspersons. These are volunteer boards. As I mentioned, they're 5-member boards. They do go through a board appointment process, as one often thinks of through the Secretary of State's office, so that they do go through that process. But they do have really this key role to play in terms of being the primary oversight mechanism. They both appoint the ombudspersons and can remove them, right? And so that's, we think, a pretty important role that they play.
Chair Rest, can I follow up on that?
I'm sorry, Senator Driscowski, you were finished? So I'm calling on, again, on Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Rest.
Sure.
So when you talk about how many members are on this board and only a small amount of them are, or only a few of them are showing up, is there a clear mission that is a directive in law that this board understands that it's supposed to be fulfilling? And without very many of the board members come, is that their authority being met?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Jacobs, I think to your first question of is that responsibility being met, I think the answer that we found is no. They aren't holding their meetings as often as they should. When they're holding meetings, they don't have their full contingent in attendance. They're not fulfilling their duties in law. So, I think overall our takeaway is no, the sort of oversight responsibility of those boards is not being met. I think there's a number of different reasons for that. We talked about whether or not, that they're volunteer boards. And so I think there's been some challenges on that front, but I'll note too that those challenges have been longstanding. One board, for instance, for several years now has not even had 5 members appointed. They've just not even had the number of people, it's not even that they're not showing up. They don't even have the number of appointees that they should. And so I think there have been some longstanding challenges on
Ms.
the
Badger,
board.
who are the appointing authority? Is it strictly coming from the governor? Just following up on Representative Jacobs' comment, and just in general, do they serve at the pleasure of their appointing authorities? Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair, if you look on page 8 of our report, you can see who those appointing authorities are for each of those community boards. So specifically, the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, the chair of that council appoints members of the African American Community Board. The Council on Asian, so the councils are responsible for appointing those boards. I'll say the boards are subject to sort of typical board requirements in law, so there is language that would be applicable to them of, if board members aren't attending as required, they can be removed. the nature of that is typical for these boards as it is for many sort of appointed boards, but it is atypical in the sense that the governor does not appoint the board members, or less typical, I should say.
Representative Jacobs, any further question?
Yeah, maybe just more of a statement.
Sure.
It just appears as though both the OBFF and the board themselves are kind of playing on each other on who's in control, and therefore no one's in control, and they are largely able to just do what they want without guardrails. And I guess I would have one final question. You mentioned the group that was a mouthful, African American, but that group or other groups, do we have a number of amount of dollars that are going out through this OBFF to support those groups?
Ms. Badger?
Senator Rest and Representative Jacob, correct me if I'm wrong, but just to confirm, I believe you're referring to this DCYF's African American Child and Well-Being Advisory Council that I mentioned one of the ombudspersons can participate in. Thank you.
Yes.
So as far as like funds going out of OBFF to support that group, that's not really the arrangement of how that works. So it's more, again, think of it as like an advisory council or a work group. And so it would more just be one of OBFF's ombudspersons participating in that. It's not any sort of direct transfer of funds, for example, on that.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. May I go on, Representative Jacobs, or did you have something else?
Thank you, Chair S. One. Yeah, that's fine. Just go ahead to the next question. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and that would be Senator, Senator Coran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And boy, we've there's a lot of gray areas here, and really, at some point, Senator Jaskowski's the statute's fairly clear. I think it's even more clear by the creation of it and the types of positions that are staffed in it. It would appear it would be more traditional ombudsperson roles, which is pretty heavily based in complaints, right? Helping navigate whatever. We have so many of them because our state agencies fail, our county, right? The entire entities fails and very complex, and we need people to guide them through those. So it does appear there's some clarity, but this office was established, 1991, I believe? And Ms. Badger, has there been a report done before, an OLA report?
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rust and Senator Cran, there was an OLA financial audit evaluation done quite a number of years ago. To my knowledge, there has not been a program evaluation done of this office previously.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. Madam Chair?
Senator Coran?
And it would appear so because you guys are very good at referencing the previous work and the unmet or the recommendations being either met or not. But when you look at the types of staffing, right? You've got an ombudsperson, 3 of them, deputy ombudsperson, who has a lot of obligations, an investigator, intake specialist. Intake would almost imply investigations or complaints, right, in that whole trail. An office manager, somebody's got to do the work. On page 13, you mentioned there's 33 complaint investigations. This is for a full 2-year period? Oh, 2023, okay. How many complaints were made? It mentions that investigation, so they actually took a complaint in an undefined process, and 33 were there. How many complaints were received by all 3 entities or all 3 ombudspersons?
Ms. Badger?
Chair Rust and Senator Cran, it's a good question, and there's not a clear answer to it. I mentioned that they have real issues with data, both documentation and data collection. And I would say those issues are to the extent that they do not have data on how many complaints they received, how many complaints they investigated. They did report roughly 500, a little more than 500 complaints and inquiries receiving in that year, 2023. We don't know what is a complaint versus an inquiry, and that's not defined. So that 500 number, one, we can't verify it. Two, it's a little bit murky as to what that means. But to try and give a little bit of a perspective, they reported those 500 plus complaints and inquiries in comparison to the 33 investigations. Again, we couldn't confirm 33 because of the lack of data, but that was what they had reported that year.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. Madam Chair?
Senator Coran.
And so 500, I mean, I think the structure is, and first off, 500 people had to find the entity, which many don't know the entity even exists. So I would think with that many calls and queries that it is, I think the intent is clear. It's established to help people navigate through the process. And clearly, it's a very low priority. We're not sure how that's set. On the structure of, on page, your slide 15, you've got community boards and then joint board, and I think you've clarified it. Each of those has, each entity, African American, Asian, and Spanish, have their own boards appointed, and you have, I think you mentioned 1 year someone was in compliant. Was it 1 year that all of them were compliant at least once in that period, or one was compliant in that entire period?
Ms. Badger.
Chair Rest and Senator Cran, that 1 year that I was referring to was the 1 year out of those 3 years that the joint board was compliant. Of the 3 community boards, when we took a look, the Asian Pacific Community Board was the only board that at least had documentation of consistently meeting those requirements. The Spanish-speaking board, for example, didn't meet at all over that period of time.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Ms. Badger and Madam Chair.
Senator Coran.
You answered my question, is who didn't meet at all? And so with that, then, in your report and in sitting in the reporting, then, they're supposed to meet quarterly, or at least 4 times a year. And so what is the communication mechanism for the ombudspersons in the office to report the progress to their governing board? Do they provide it weekly, monthly, quarterly? If they don't meet, or annually, is there any type of communication, and how would that board be informed of their progress?
Ms. Badger.
Senator Rest and Senator Cran, it's a good question. I'm sure the ombudspersons could provide some additional information on this. Each ombudsperson kind of takes a different approach, and this is a theme we found throughout the evaluation, is that things aren't done consistently across each ombudsperson. One ombudsperson sends periodic reports to their board, roughly quarterly, but not always. Another ombudsperson also periodically sends reports, but we didn't see any evidence of them meeting. The other ombudsperson meets in person with the boards more frequently, but we didn't see any reports. So it's kind of a hodgepodge. As I said, I'm sure they could provide some additional information on that front as well, but it's a little different depending on the board and the ombudsperson.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair, just follow up,
Senator Coran.
when looking through all of the issues, it's almost, originally I thought, well, it was just designed to fail, but I can't see any measurable accomplishment in the entire report. And I think you've made many mentions. I do think there's a great need in I think every category you measured it, everybody's response, even if they didn't know the agencies exist, when you talked about what it should be or what they think it is, that there's a high demand. I would agree. I've been through the process of custody, my oldest granddaughter. I know what it's like to go through in an environment you don't plan on. And so it's a very complicated process in the most emotional time of your life because of the scenario and the complexities of state law. We guide that, we hand that down to the counties to implement it, and there's all a wide variety of even more complex issues. And so I see it being a great need to function as a pure ombudsperson role. But how could that I'm not sure could even be accomplished. You have nobody that reports to anybody. And even within the office, because there's a division by race, that they can't possibly unite on how do you even allocate resources and how do you set the priorities? I do think the priorities and the goals are common across the board. And if complaints and investigations and aren't part of their primary role, how would you ever learn the intricacies of every single element and the complexity of that to understand where, one, first off, to meet the needs of the family that is in great need in the most critical time of their life, but how would they be able to become those experts in any one facet of the myriad of issues that are related to child protective service, out-of-home placement, because it is very different agencies from the county performance, from the judiciary side, and all of those things. And so I think we certainly see a great need to reform or provide really, really clear statutory intent of what this office should be providing. But I just don't know how they can even function and to share those or to have a shared resource. And I think it's clear they're doing the things that are, I think, important to somebody, but not to what we've just determined the need. And I don't think it meets the needs of the citizens that are tied up in these services. So I appreciate the work you guys have done. And Madam Chair, I'll wait till till we get the report. So thank you.
Senator Rand. Representative Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the question for the auditor's office is just going back to the community board piece. To what extent do the ethnic councils have oversight responsibility of the community boards?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Chair Lee, or Representative Lee, thank you for the question. In terms of sort of oversight, they're responsible for appointing the board members. They do, again, I mentioned in law, these boards are subject to some of the typical language you would see for boards about if, board members are not attending as required, then the appointing authority, which in this case would be the council, has the authority and the power then to remove board members often upon recommendation. And so I would say, largely, their role is to appoint these members. We did hear it does seem to vary quite a bit in terms of the actual sort of practical on the ground role that the councils play. It sounds like varying degrees of engagement amongst the councils and these boards and sort of the appointment process and how responsive they have been and things like that. So it does, again, sort of to this common theme of it varies per ombudsperson. This was another area where we saw things varied based on the council, based on the community board, in terms of sort of what that looked like day to day.
Representative Lee?
Madam Chair, thank you. So I see that, when I go on the website, I think 2 of the 3 community boards don't have their full members. And so I'm just curious, did you all reach out to the councils to get some feedback on why are they not fulfilling their duties to have even just the full complement of the members on the boards?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Lee, we did have conversations with the council, certainly reached out to them. I think it's a combination of factors, is my understanding. I'll also note that, and we talk about this a little bit in the report, the ombudspersons are also involved in this process of sort of appointing their council members. That's another thing we sort of flag as a potential issue in terms of sort of how effectively these community boards oversee the ombudspersons, if the ombudspersons are also playing a role in their appointment. I think in terms of why there have been vacancies, we identified sort of as a long-term challenge. You're right, currently 2 of the boards have vacancies. I mentioned that one of those boards has had vacancies for multiple years. I think there have been challenges identifying folks to participate. I mentioned it's volunteer boards, and so I think there are a number of different factors coming into play. I'm sure the ombudspersons would also have insight into where there have been challenges in recruiting or maintaining community board members. But you're correct to identify this, it's currently an issue of not having full membership, and it has been, for quite some time, particularly for one of the boards.
Thank you, Representative Lee. Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did, when I first put my hand up, it was going to be a simple question, and now I've had several more thoughts that I'm trying to process. But I keep coming back kind of to what Senator Cran said. We're dealing with people here and children, and that this was created with the best intention to try to be helping people. And I want to go back to the investigation. So do we know, in terms of transparency, is there anything like on the website that we have, is it 33 investigations started or 33 completed? And what is the result of those investigations? What's the feedback mechanism to the people who, where the harm may have been? I mean, is there that type of, on face value, if you look on the website, can you find that information out?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Hanson, a couple of things. One, there's very limited information about the complaints process on their website. That was a sort of a recommendation that we have to the agency, is that there needs to be some greater transparency around how do they investigate, what do they investigate, what might be outcomes of an investigation, that they need to provide some more transparency around that. To your question of sort of what have the outcomes of this been, that was a key question that we looked into, and unfortunately, again, because of the really limited documentation and data that they collect, we don't know. So for instance, we looked at a selection of complaint files for recent complaints that they've been looking at. We wanted to know things of like, what sort of investigatory duties do they do? Did they substantiate a complaint? Things like that. That information isn't available. They don't collect data on even whether or not a complaint was substantiated. It wasn't available in any of the files. And so honestly, sort of what the outcomes, what the results of those investigations are, is not clear. We know the ombudspersons take sort of different paths. They might conduct an investigation. The other thing they might do, they say they monitor cases sometimes to sort of make sure things look like it's going okay. Or they might consult with families. But again, there's no clear definition of what any of those activities really are. How many cases were consulted versus investigated versus monitored, we don't know. Just the sort of basic information you would expect, unfortunately doesn't exist.
Madam Chair.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it was mentioned that it has a subpoena authority, but in terms of the penalty phase, does it have administrative, criminal, and civil authority if there were violations of state law found?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Hanson, it's a great question. Ombudspersons, and this is typical for ombudspersons, their role and their only authority goes to the point of making recommendations. They cannot force a county to comply with something that they recommend that they do. It really is a recommendation, sort of similar in the way to our office makes recommendations to agencies, but we can't ultimately hold their feet to the fire and make them do it. I'll note as a little caveat to that, there is some language in law. They can at least require that whatever agency they had concerns about, they can require them to report back what they did or if they didn't do anything. So there's at least a little bit, could be a little bit of a feedback loop there, but they can't require anybody to do anything.
Representative Hanson.
Madam Chair, and then just check if I have this right. So we have the councils that appoint to community boards, who then work to have a joint board, which then has the authority for hiring staff for the joint board? Or is it, and what's the feedback loop to get it back to the councils?
Madam Chair and Representative Hanson, almost. So the joint board is meant to oversee the office overall. There are also those community boards. They do operate separately as well to oversee each individual ombudspersons. So those community boards kind of have a two-pronged responsibility. They individually oversee the ombudspersons, and they are supposed to come together as the joint board to oversee them overall. As far as feedback loop to the councils, again, that really is sort of on a per ombudsperson basis. There's nothing in law, for instance, that says now the councils need to check in, and so if an ombudsperson reaches out to the council, shares how things are going, or a board member, that might happen on an ad hoc basis. There isn't any sort of feedback loop requirement there.
Madam Chair.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you. And it seems to me we just have to keep learning that it's very difficult to manage or govern by committee or several committees. There doesn't seem to be a chain of command here for any accountability. Good intentions, we want to have community involved in decision-making, but we also want decision-making and have people protected. And I'm not sure how the legislature works its way through this. It seems that perhaps we give them a sunset date of a year or something to get this figured out, or it's over and we start over with some other way of providing the protection. But clearly, looks like systematic failure everywhere with this, and we have to do better. And I'm not being critical of the people involved, because if you don't have board members who are participating, you can't have boards, you don't have that authority, it's a structure that's not going to work, and we should start over to try to make sure that this need is filled.
Thank you, Representative Hanson. I think we'll turn now to hearing from the representative of the ombudsperson, and that would be, and we welcome Ann Hill. Welcome to the commission. Please identify yourself for the record.
My name is Ann Hill, and I'm with the Office of Ombudspersons for Families. I'm the ombudsperson for African American families, and I have my two colleagues here with me today. I want to thank you for your time and your attention to this issue. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Muriel Gubasta. I'm the Ombudsperson for Minnesota Spanish-speaking and Hispanic Latino families.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Zuniga. I'm the Ombudsperson for Asian and Pacific Families with the Office of Ombudsperson for Families.
And who is going to respond?
Madam Chair,
Hill.
I am Ann Hill, the probably the most senior ombudsperson. I've been here the longest. I have a prepared presentation, but I don't think it's appropriate. I'm just going to be honest.
And we do have limited time.
Time
so
too,
we
yeah.
appreciate
But
that. And we appreciate the written responses that are at the end of the report. We do have those available to us.
Yes, you do, of which we've actually stipulated and agree with all of the recommendations that have come forth. And the one that probably is the most difficult and delicate is the one revising the Ombudsman's organizational structure. We recognize that it is necessary. We've agreed with it. I do want to keep in mind, though, I think some things in the legislative report were miscommunicated, and I heard some legislators ask about us working on matters, advocating for matters that are not, that are federal legislation. That was not the case. We have worked on laws that are specifically adopted by the state of Minnesota. One being the Family First Family Prevention Act. That is a Minnesota, it was a federal requirement, but it is a state of Minnesota law that we adopted. And the African American Family Preservation Act and Disproportionality Act, actually, it was legislation that came out of complaints to our office. So it is a statewide now law that it will work to improve outcomes for kids in out-of-home placement. All kids, actually, not just African-American kids. So I think some of that information was miscommunicated. These were both laws that came out of some of the concerns that our communities had and some of the work that the Office of Ombudspersons was dealing with. One other thing I think people should keep in mind, you don't have to, but the legislative auditor looked at our, again, we've been around 30 years. We've had 2 financial audits. We had a request for a program audit, but we didn't get it. At the time that we got it, it was right after we had already reorganized, we were beginning to reorganize. It's 2 years that they're reviewing out of 30 years of operation. So we have been quite effective over the 30 years that we've been around. 2 years, we will stipulate, in the last 5 years with COVID and our office reorganizing, going from 4 ombudsmen to 3 ombudsmen, absolutely right, boards all over the place. It's been a challenge for us. And where they have on the books now that we have 7 staff, between the time of the investigation, the majority of the staff were 2 people, it's Muriel and I, because we had.
Well, Ann, I can speak to that. So
You need to address the chair every time you speak.
I'm sorry, Senator
okay.
Russ.
It's mostly for the record and the tape, so that you can be identified when you speak. If you address the chair before you make a comment, there's no question about who is talking.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I
Sure.
appreciate that clarification. And just to add on to what Ann was talking about, yes, we know and we understand that the review period here is for 22, 23, and 24. I think what's important to understand or know, or just to have this additional information, is that prior to 1922, I'm sorry, I meant to say 2022, is that there were staff changes. The Ombudsperson for Asian Pacific Families, Bao Neng Chu, that she had retired from state service, and so that was one change that we were dealing with. And then at the end of 22, a replacement was hired. That person was with the Office of Ombudsperson for Families for about 14 months and then resigned. So we were dealing with just mainly Ann and I in the office. We also have 2 staff, the OASI, or Office Administrative Specialists, and both of those staff were out on family medical leave. So there were a lot of things that were administratively that needed to be attended to. And with these people out on FMLA and then down, just having 2 ombudspersons, it was predominantly Ann and I handling the intake, the calls. There's a lot of operational things that need to be taken care of, all those things that are related to financial management and reporting. And with our office administrative specialist out on FMLA leave, as well as the intake specialist out on FMLA leave, that's a heavy burden on a very small agency. And so when those people are not there, it falls back to the ombudspersons, which has been mentioned many times. Yes, we have a very large mandate. And so when other things are getting in our way, we have to attend to that to be sure that operationally, we are at least keeping up with other things.
Thank
So I
you.
just wanted to, just provide a little extra detail on that, and I know Ann's going to continue with, or no?
Ms. Hill, do you have any further comments, or shall we turn to something further from you? Or, and I'm sorry, I don't have your name in front of me.
Of course.
So I will just ask you to identify yourself once more.
My name is Manuel Zuniga. I'm the Ombudsperson for Asian Pacific Families, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Do you have some comments to make?
I do, in the sense that, just very briefly, I believe that you can see from the OLA's report that the need for the agency and the specific intent for the legislation to assist in alleviating the racial disparities in child protection is a major need for this state and for the children and families that we serve. And I would just, I guess, focus on what things we might be able to collectively do to be able to support the children and families that we serve. So our agency is attempted to do the best we can with the resources that we've been allotted, but I would just ask the commission to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Did you have something further to add?
Madam Chair, I think the only comment I would like to make is that, yes, the Office of Ombudsperson for Families, we know that we have broad powers, and it has been mentioned that we ombudspersons spend time on activities that are not expressly stated in our enabling legislation. And that activity is spent on these different, within these different task forces and policymaking. So if the Office of Ombudsperson for Families is truly going to monitor all laws that govern child protection in the state of Minnesota, we need to be on these task forces and in these policymaking groups, because it is those groups that are initiating legislation to be introduced to the Minnesota legislature. We are oftentimes, or most of the time, invited by these groups to be at the table to present our perspectives on the communities that we represent. So, in my opinion, it has been mischaracterized that we are spending time on activities that are not expressly stated in our legislation. This is why we have broad powers, and the communities, the founding members of the Office of Ombudsperson for Families, this is exactly what they had in mind, is that the ombudspersons be a neutral, they be called to the table, be invited to the table to explain what it is that they, as the ombudspersons serving the different communities, are seeing happening in Minnesota's child welfare system, child protection system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Quam, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I was hoping to hear more positive, we've got these solutions instead of excuses. I was curious, what percentage of, or even if it's just a number, of the investigations were for the half of the kids in foster care that aren't within the three groups that you are designated on?
Do you have a response to that, any of you?
Well, Madam Chair and Representative Quam,
Thank you.
I do not, or I don't think any of us have with us right now that count or those numbers. So,
Madam Chair,
Representative Quam.
do any of the three of you remember any investigations outside of your designated specific portions of the population?
Madam Chair,
Representative Quam, I don't understand your question.
Madam Chair, I think I understand
Okay, Ms. Hill.
question. And Representative, I want to be clear here. Actually, the majority of many of the calls that come to our office are outside of African American, Latino, and Asian, the majority. Specifically, with respect to investigations, I couldn't give you that information because everything really, most calls don't really result in an investigation. These are administrative decisions that are made at the county level. We do look into every call that comes to us. We do have a process of looking through it. One of the things that we did, and I'm not, please don't take this as an excuse. I am just pointing out where we were in time, We purchased a case management system that never, ever worked. We purchased in 2019. Our understanding that it was going to be fixed, the company it was a calamity of things that happened, so I'm not going to go into details about it. But I can tell you under no uncertain terms that the majority of the calls that come to our office, and we do offer resources, which is something also that ombudsmen do. They can consult, we can offer resources, resource assistance, or we can investigate. And we've done one of those things with everyone who's called to our office. So we can get you the numbers of who outside of a person of color that called our office, who we've in some way had a conversation with or provided them with a consultation or a resource. So we can get that information to you. You want for those 2 years? Or are you asking for those during the 2 years of the program review?
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. See, I have constituents, and these two foster moms, their family, have multiple kids across different ethnic backgrounds. One that had some mental or behavioral issues, which is somewhat common because of the circumstances. They had a problem with the county, which was directly helping with the programs, and the only access that they were able to find was going back to the same person they had the problems with for trying to address the issues. And I had a bill drafted with her, working with the revisor, to try and have assurance that somebody comes in and doesn't fit into one of the buckets, I think there were 4 at that time, would still be able to have an avenue to help the kids, because that's what we're all here for, is to be able to help the kids. So, offline, if you can get some information as things have changed, and also offline, have an understanding of if there are any dues or funds that go into the 13 organizations that you're associating with, so we understand that. But every one of us here would be fine with you coming and testifying before the appropriate committee anytime. You don't have to be part of any of these other groups. And so your input helps us do a better fix. And I do have a curiosity, what percentage of ancestry would qualify for one of your groups, or if you have mixed, it always goes into the mixed background, just for the people listening. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Quam. Ms. Hill, and then after you comment, I'm going to make a comment, and then the hearing's going to come to an end. Ms. Hill.
Madam Chair and members of the community, members of the committee.
I will call on
I'm sorry.
Senator Coran as well, but I'm going to make the final comment. Senator Coran. But Ms. Hill, first response from you to Representative Quam.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, we don't determine, we take people's word for who they are. There's no particular blood quantum anybody has to meet to be considered a person of color. If they tell us they're a person of color, they're a person of color. If they tell us that they're two or more mixed races, then they are two or more. If they tell us that they're Caucasian, they are Caucasian. But we actually received heat initially from the legislative auditor that we were taking cases that were not children or people or families of color. And we chose many, many years ago to do that because family members are complicated. They're complicated. I know people of color who've adopted white children. I know white families who have adopted black children. So how those, or that just poor families in general have the same problems that families of color have. And that's was really one of the reasons behind, even though it says the African American Family Preservation and Disproportionality Act, that was one of the impotence, one of the things about that act that we wanted to include, and that was that those families who don't fall into an African-American class identity, but they were also disproportionately represented because of poverty, because of a certain kind of disability, because they live in rural areas and there's not resources. They are also included in, now that act, actually that act will cover about 80 to 85% of all kids in out-of-home placement, allowing us now to use active efforts in working with those families just as we do with Native American children. So this act was, we don't take the blood, people tell us who they are. We proceed with taking the intake. And now because we do have an investigator, we did not have an investigator at the time that we had a legislative audit. We did not during that period of time. We did not have a deputy ombudsman. All of these are new positions. We didn't have them. I mean, we were just at the end of COVID, and we had these, again, it's not, believe me, this is not an excuse. This was the conditions we were dealing with at the time. And I just want to clarify that. But people identify themselves. We do not discriminate or say that we can't look into. I've had legislators call me on numerous occasions about people in their district, and we followed up and followed through on it.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Senator Coran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so part of the question I had was there was the other staff positions are new, and that's a 3-year period. Why weren't any of them filled?
Ms. Hill?
Yeah, you want to take it? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, Senator Coran. So in 2019, when the Office of Ombudsperson for Families received additional funding for these 3 positions, once we received the funding, then what we had to do was work on the position descriptions for the investigators as well as the deputy ombudsperson. When we completed that, the process is that the position descriptions go to Human Resources for their review and okay on it, so we did that. From HR, it goes to Minnesota Management and Budget for their review of it. That took about 4 to 6 months. So that's the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. As we all know, the world was turned upside down at the beginning of 2020 with the beginning of the pandemic. And the Office of Ombudsperson for Families had received notification or the message from Human Resources as well as MMB that there was a halt, there was a freeze on all hiring throughout the state of Minnesota. Governor Walz did not, or he released, I'm trying to think of the word I want to use, but ended the shelter at home or the official pandemic sometime in '21. So at that time, we had to pick up where we left off. And as I mentioned earlier, so when I'm talking about picking up where we left off, I'm talking about posting these, so now we're like mid-2021, posting these job descriptions, interviewing people. And again, as I stated earlier, in '22, we were just down to 2 staff, mainly Ann and I. We did not have the administrative support to assist us with this. So for this reason, there had been this delay.
Madam Chair?
Senator Karan.
And Ms. Gubasta, you backed up to 2019. This is, right, I spent just under 18 years in the Department of Revenue. I know how it works. All of these positions have an equivalent in 6, 8, 10 different agencies of all of these. This is an ombudsman role. We have many of them. And so they already exist, so I understand it works slowly. But you just described everything up till 2020, end of 2021, maybe 22. This period covers 22, 23, 24. And so you've had two out on family medical leave. Kind of interesting, because this very business unit, if it was a private business, would be bankrupt and out of business, right? For the very thing that we're implementing today, paid family, paid medical. It'd be the same thing. Only in government, you guys still have a job, the business unit exists, and we just do less and less. And so we can't do that. And so when we look at this comfort of, wow, it's been a tough time, the critical needs of family child protective services didn't change. None of that changed, and it only grows. And that's what frustrates me, if you can't tell. And so when I look at it, you brought, Ms. Hill, you brought up the great piece of the African American Family Preservation Act. It serves everybody. And so when you measure by socioeconomic status, I've been through, right, it doesn't discriminate much. And so, but we've added this element of race into it. I think we're to the point now, the African American Family Preservation Act, as we look at restructuring what this unit should be, likely should have an ombudsman and deputy ombudsmans, which are specialists in specific functions of child care or child protective services, out-of-home plate, right? It's a combo from the legal side, right? From the expert being within the county Department of Human Services. So we have those subject matter experts, and it is, I think, by intent, because we don't issue subpoena power casually to anybody. And so I think it's a very important intent when it was created, but nothing's been done. And the lack of any institutional stuff, because we talk up, well, what about up to 2019? This office been since 1991, and so it doesn't appear help was asked for, whatever it was, but I will gladly work, but I work with Representative Hansen and everybody. How the heck do we reform it? Because even in its current form and the way it's structured, I don't think the direction could be provided. Definitely going to have some, and be in some entity that has some controls. You have to be able to report. The whole board structure, it's not functioning. And so it's going to have to be structured, because I do think it is a real critical need, that it serves everybody, and we really focus on the specificity of the tasks as they're aligned, right, in the critical needs of the way the process works. And so I will be there as a resource to be able to help that. But boy, I'm a little frustrated that there's nothing, and we just allow this to happen. And literally in the private sector, if anything happened, this unit would be gone. This business would have been gone and dissolved. We don't have that luxury, because we have real needs, and that we have to get it to function, and we got to get it to function in a pretty dang short time frame. So thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Let me take the time.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Coran. I want to thank the legislative auditor's staff and the three of you. The mission that you have regarding the children of Minnesota is probably one of the most important things that you do. And I take very seriously the charge to the legislature. The charge to the legislature is that we created this. We created the opportunity and almost the invitation for you to fail. And so it's on us. It is not on you. I believe that the chaos that you have to deal with going forward in service to your mission is one that we bear responsibility for as a legislature. And we probably should have had this report done for prior years, so that the biggest recommendation that is coming from the OLA is that the legislature needs to do something, needs to help with reforming, needs to help in supporting your activities, and we should have started that yesterday. So I share the frustration that has been expressed by the members of the Legislative Audit Commission, but we have a keen responsibility to you and to the children that you attempt to serve through so many different ways, not all of which end up being very effective, but that you take that mission seriously. And with that, we thank you for being with us today, and we are adjourned.